Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is Thursday, April 18th, and we have some more NBA play-in action to go over from last night, from the 76ers and Heat game to the Chicago Bulls and the Atlanta Hawks. So we're going to be talking about those games specifically. We're also going to be talking about the fallout of the 76ers Miami Heat game, where Jimmy Butler has suffered an MCL injury, and we're going to go over sort of the consequences surrounding that and what it looks like for the Heat moving forward here, as they have some uncertainty as to whether or not they can still make the playoffs. And then finally, after talking all of this NBA, I'm going to finish off the show with some thoughts about the story that ESPN put out about Bill Belichick and his coaching search during the offseason, his job search, I should say, and the role that Robert Kraft potentially played in it, which is definitely an interesting story there. But before we get into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. For our live viewers, to be free to use the comment section, give us your thoughts on these latest games and all of the latest happenings in sports. I'll try and address as many comments as I can, make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. But getting into last night's game between the 76ers and the Miami Heat, the Sixers come out in this one in a very close matchup. In order to clinch the 7 seed, they will now be facing the New York Knicks in the 2-7 matchup in the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs. But as for last night, frankly, especially in the first half, this was a pretty ugly offensive performance on both ends, where we know Philadelphia is still trying to work Joel Embiid back into shape, back into the groove of things, and statistically he's been still very impactful, but there is some level of conditioning that you just can't replicate necessarily during a training setting, and there are moments where it is a little more apparent than others, but still he is helping the 76ers to close out the regular season on an 8-game win streak, I believe it was, and now they pick up their 9th straight game headed into their series against the New York Knicks. But in the first half of this one, like I mentioned, it was pretty ugly on offense, where Miami's zone defense, which obviously is such a big topic with the Heat, especially when the playoffs come around, and the way that they're able to just throw these looks at opposing teams in these playoff series that just absolutely break their brains. And that's what was happening in the first half of this game, where even in the first quarter alone, the 76ers turned the ball over 7 times, 12 times total in the first half, and that's really how the Heat were able to build up the lead that they were going into halftime, where the Heat haven't had a great half-court offense really all season, and that was further displayed in this game against Philadelphia, but they were able to turn that defense into offense. They were getting fast break opportunities, they were scoring off the turnovers, scored 17 alone in the first half off of turnovers, and limited the 76ers to just 39 points at the half. Jimmy Butler was a massive part of the level of defense and the transition scoring on the other side as well in this first half. He had 4 steals, but at the very end of the first quarter, Kevin Love threw a full court pass to him on the other end. he ends up drawing a foul, getting himself to the free throw line, but he immediately goes down and was grabbing at his right knee, was clearly injured. He was able to play out the rest of the game, but he was absolutely hindered, and that became apparent. Just the level of aggression he was able to play with, the explosiveness that we see from Jimmy Butler in these big moments. We sit around waiting this whole regular season where Butler really wasn't all that tremendous because, frankly, he doesn't care about the regular season. And then for this to happen in the Heat's first, call it a postseason game, don't call it a postseason game. I think the NBA definitely needs to work out how they want to classify these types of games, but again, he ends up going down with his MCL injury. We'll be diving more into the ramifications of that as the show goes on here. But again, Philly was just not able to really get into their game. Specifically, the Heat did a tremendous job of limiting Joel Embiid, who was just 2 of 8 from the field in the first half. And things seemed to be a little ugly there in Philadelphia, where the team was getting booed for much of the second quarter into the third quarter as well. Felt a little bad for Tobias Harris, who was sort of on the receiving end after there was missing a free throw. He stepped out of bounds. He airballed a 3, and the Philly fans were really not just giving it to him. It was the situation as a whole, but he was the recipient of a lot of it at least. And not even joking, it was really until that third quarter, just about halfway through, when Caleb Martin missed 2 free throws to give the Sixers fans this promotion of 2 missed free throws equals free chicken. And once that happened, the crowd really started getting into it. And the Sixers, at least, seemed like maybe it was just a coincidence, who knows. But that's when they started getting their energy up and they started playing their better game. They ended up going on a 9-0 run during that sequence, cut the deficit to 3, and then enter Nick Batum, who was the hero of this game for Philadelphia. As a part of Miami's zone defense, they were making it very difficult. Like I said, first half they were limiting Joel Embiid a lot. They were just making those entry passes very hard for Embiid to go get it. Kevin Love in particular was relentless in denying those entry passes. Embiid was trying to get in around the free throw line and on the block, and the Heat just weren't having it. But then with all of this extra attention being diverted to Joel Embiid, the Sixers started getting these open looks, and it was a pretty rough three-point shooting night for the majority of players on the team, but not for Nick Batum. And inherently, when you're playing a zone defense in basketball, the ways to beat it is to make the right passes and to knock down your open shots. And specifically, again, Batum was the man for the job, where he finished the night 6 of 10 from 3. The rest of the team was 6 of 25, but he really started getting himself going in that second half, which is what helped propel Philadelphia to this win. And it wasn't just the offense from Batum himself. The Sixers as a whole, they stopped turning the ball over like they were in the first half. Again, making those right passes to force the Heat to sort of be behind in their rotations. And again, feeding Embiid, who, as things currently, they always are with Joel Embiid, he requires that extra level of attention. And because of it, he, from the last time these two teams played in Embiid's second game back from injury from today, he just looked much more comfortable in my eyes, passing out of the double teams when it called for it. He was also spending a lot more time on the perimeter, knocked down a couple threes, including the 3 in the start of the fourth quarter. In this case, he was wide open. He knocks that one down to finally tie the game after Philly had sort of been circling in on the Heat for about a quarter at this point. And then a couple minutes later, once again, it was Nick Batum giving them the go-ahead 3 to give the Sixers their first lead since the first quarter. And the game was highly contested from that point on, a lot of back and forth. The Heat, who sort of had to make this adjustment. Like I said, they were really benefiting in that first half from turning defense into offense. Once Philly started playing smarter, it was clear how connected both sides of the ball are for Miami. But it was Tyler Hero who really, when you look at his stat line as a whole, believe he was 9 of 27 on the night. But yeah, 9 of 27. But he was the one who really started getting himself going. And again, I know that it's not the prettiest box score out there, but I remember when these teams did face off a couple weeks ago, in that fourth quarter, the Heat only scored 17 points. They couldn't even get a decent shot look, really. They had gone 6+ minutes at one point without making a field goal in that game. And as I watched that game, I said, this is clearly why they need Tyler Hero. And the narrative that they're better without him just doesn't fly for me because of the fact that they don't have the elite shot creators, especially with the fact that Jimmy Butler was hindered in this game. And Hero really started getting himself going. I believe he ended up with 12 in the quarter. It was at least 12, could have even been more. But speaking of Hero, it was Batum on the other end who sort of shut him down on 2 straight possessions to seal this game for Philadelphia, where Miami had the ball with about 40 seconds left in this game. The game was tied at 96, and the pressure that Batum gave Tyler Hero off ball forced him into a backcourt violation off of a dribble handoff around that half-court mark. Now, it was a little bit of a push, but this was a very physical game, really, on both ends. I forgot how much I disliked the complaining of Kyle Lowry when you get into a playoff setting when it comes to, obviously, respect Kyle Lowry a ton, but, I mean, he throws his arms up at every chance he gets, whether it's a missed call or he gets called for something on the other end. It was giving me, as a Celtics fan at least, a little bit of flashbacks from that miserable series last year that the Celtics just didn't come to play in. But that's just sort of an aside. But this was a very physical game. So Batum, he gets away with that one a little bit. Honestly, it's just how the game was officiated. You can be mad about it if you are a Miami fan, for sure. But at the same time, I think that you can call them all missed calls, or you can say that's just how the refs decided to play it. I thought they were pretty consistent in terms of the physicality throughout the night. But then after that turnover from Hero, Heat went down on the other end, and Kelly Oubre had an and one layup to go, gave Philadelphia the 3-point lead. And then when Miami came back on the other end, a little bit of an erratic. I understand the situation, the way that Tyler Hero was feeling himself and nobody else was getting anything to go, that it was just, I don't think it was quite as bad of a shot take as others seemed to. It definitely wasn't the number one shot take that they could have gotten away with, especially the fact it was with 27 seconds. I think a lot of people were sort of pointing, did Tyler Hero think that a 2-for-1 opportunity was the best way to go there? Not really sure what was going through his head in particular there, but he ends up pulling up from 3, and it was Batum blocking the shot to pretty much seal the game there. Batum finished the game with 20 points. He had that block, and he forced that other turnover, like I mentioned, was really a key 3-point shooter for this Philadelphia team that wasn't getting a ton going on offense in the half court until there was the threat of his shooting. And at a certain point, I'm never going to question Eric Spoelstra. He obviously knows more than any of us in terms of coaching. But at what point do you start to realize, okay, this defense that we're running, they're starting to actually knock down these shots, or at least specifically Batum is, maybe we should make sure that we're on him. But either way, he ends up being the hero in this one. It wasn't a dominant Joel Embiid game by any means. Like I mentioned, he was 2 of 8 at the half. He ended up 6 of 17, which isn't great, especially for his standards, but also got himself going in the fourth quarter a little bit more. He definitely took advantage of the space that Miami was giving some of these shooters. He knocked down a couple threes. I believe they were both in the fourth quarter. and he ends up in this game with 23 points, 15 rebounds, and like I mentioned, definitely a lot more comfortable in the real game scenarios, passing out of double teams and finding his open shooters, much more so than when he was first returning from injury, had 5 assists in this game as well. And just his presence as well in the paint is something that you sort of can't take away from. Just a sort of separate note here. We've had some interesting nights in terms of some comments made from some of the announcers, and not that I'm, criticizing them necessarily all too much, but the other night we had Reggie Miller when Anthony Davis was going to the free throw line with about 10 or so seconds left. I think it was maybe even less than that. And Reggie Miller was talking about the idea of intentionally missing the second one. I think it was 3 seconds left at the time. And Miller was talking about the idea of, well, do you purposefully miss this one, not go up by 2 possessions? And I don't really know what his justification for the argument was. I feel like I'm sure he's fine, but probably regretting it a little bit in the coming days. It did not come out as a very basketball IQ heavy comment there. And then last night, I just thought the sort of discourse that was in that first half of Doris Burke acting like she had never heard of foul baiting before, and was sort of getting on JJ Redick's case a little bit for a comment that he made about the job that Joel Embiid does, and Jimmy Butler as well, for foul baiting, and she was acting like it was this unheard of thing before, and she sort of tried to roast NBA Twitter, talking about I don't pay attention to any of that, which is probably fair to some degree, but also I don't know. It was a very strange comment to me for Doris, who obviously, and for good reason, is a very big fan of Joel Embiid. She's made that clear through her career here, but I just thought that was a very strange moment there, and we've just piled on to the Reggie Miller comments from the other night. Feel like we're off to a little bit of an interesting start, announcers-wise, in terms of the NBA playoffs here. Again, not technically the playoffs, but you know what I mean. But obviously, in this game, other than that, Tyrese Maxey wasn't really great himself. Now, there were a couple instances, you just see the burst with him. He is able to just ramp up into another gear, really, when you're not expecting it. He struggled from the field, specifically from the three-point line, like we covered. Everybody on Philadelphia really did. He finished with 19 points. And then on the Heat side of this, it was Hero with 25 on a pretty inefficient night, but also, again, thought that he was creating some really impactful buckets for the Heat down the stretch of this one. And Jimmy Butler, who had his 5 steals and, had moments of looking great, especially in that first half, the first quarter. I think he had 10 of his 19 points then, but went down with that knee injury at the end of the first quarter, and we have some updates on that situation. So we're going to be taking our first break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be diving into the ramifications of Jimmy Butler's injury and what it means for the Miami Heat going forward. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some moose shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up our recap on the 76ers Heat game, but unfortunately the big story that sort of came out of that, other than some discourse about the 76ers Knicks series that we'll probably get more into tomorrow, is the fact that Jimmy Butler is now expected to miss several weeks with an MCL injury. He went down at the end of that first quarter after being fouled, and now it seems like his season and the Miami Heat season could come to a close. As we get into this segment, just a reminder to use the comment section for our live viewers. Give us your thoughts on this situation. But again, it was Butler going down at the end of that first quarter, and he just really never looked the same from that point on. And the Heat are at a very difficult point now where they're going to be playing another game to even clinch a postseason spot against the Chicago Bulls on Friday night. And then, assuming they win that game, they will have to face off against the Boston Celtics in the first round in that 1-8 matchup against the Celtics team that definitely the Heat have had their way against, you could say, in the past couple playoffs. They have faced the Celtics in, I believe it is 3 of the last 4 Eastern Conference Finals. They've come out on top in those series twice, but now they would be without Jimmy Butler, who has really been a kryptonite for the Celtics in these recent years. And it does seem like their chances would be a lot more diminished. Now, the Heat are 13-9 without Jimmy Butler this season, which was actually sort of surprising to me considering the handful of other injuries that they were dealing with. And they do still have plenty of talent, but again, I feel like to some level, to some degree, that offense just doesn't really have, I don't know what their issue is necessarily, whether it's they don't have, a true playmaker to initiate the offense. It's Tyler Hero running the point guard minutes for them, and last night he actually surprisingly racked up 9 assists, which I wouldn't have even guessed necessarily just off of a first watch of that game, but it doesn't seem like they necessarily have that traditional playmaker. Now, they did add a couple pieces during the season that could potentially play into an interesting role here. I actually am a big fan of DeLon Wright. I think that he is a very underrated player in the league, and he got a little bit of playtime last night, actually 23 minutes, and he struggled from the field, which was an issue, but is somebody that maybe now with Butler out, he can get some more run time. They also decided to roll with Hero as that starting point guard because of the fact that Terry Rozier is dealing with an injury. Now, I'm not actually 100% sure what the status is on him moving forward. I looked it up the other night, and I believe it might have been a quad injury that he was dealing with. He is absolutely a key piece for, take this Chicago game, as it is. I feel like Chicago is probably going to be favored at this point, but assuming the Heat move on to face the Celtics, Rozier is somebody that, especially with a little bit of history there, I could see him having a big impact. We've seen these role players for the Miami Heat step up in big moments for them, notably Caleb Martin last year in the Eastern Conference Finals. You've seen Duncan Robinson at times, who, again, he also didn't play last night. I think he was dealing with an injury headed into the game. They said he wasn't going to be on a minutes restriction. Maybe that was a smoke screen to just sort of throw off Philadelphia's game plan headed into it, but we've seen Miami in the past be able to sort of maximize their rotational pieces, but through this run, they've also had Jimmy Butler with them as the steady force for them, and it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. Now, nothing official has been reported in terms of what the timetable looks like. Shams tweeted out the idea that it's probably going to be several weeks, which I would imagine would take him through the first round of the playoffs. And by that point, I mean, their Heat season might be over as soon as Friday as well. So, is a very interesting situation here. I feel like a lot of people are really getting on Jimmy Butler's case, and as a Celtics fan who has had my hopes crushed by him in multiple years of the past, there's a little bit of a rivalry aspect of I don't love him necessarily. He beats up on my favorite team almost on a yearly basis, but I respect him a ton, despite maybe not liking some of the foul baiting at times with him. But I feel like he's getting a lot of criticism this morning, being called overrated, saying that it's in due to the fact that he doesn't take the regular season serious enough, and that somehow if he did this season, then he wouldn't have gotten injured in this game. I'm not totally sure about that. This was a little bit of a freak injury, but again, use the comment section. Let me know what you think about if there was a way to sort of prevent this injury, what your thoughts on Jimmy Butler are. I do think that the playoff Jimmy narrative is a little bit overblown, because even after the incredible first round series he had against Milwaukee last year, by the time that the Heat's playoff run had come to a close, his averages for the playoffs as a whole had sort of come back to the typical Jimmy Butler stat lines, which is still, impressive, and he's still a very good player. But again, I feel like I have a lot of conflicting feelings on Jimmy Butler. He's a great player, and it is absolutely a shame that he's dealing with this in the biggest possible time. But as for what it means for Miami, I think that this could be a close to their series. Now, I know the Bulls aren't necessarily the most intimidating opponent that the NBA has seen. They've been painfully mediocre over the past handful of years, but we see at times with them, they are able to sort of, I feel like whenever you look at the betting lines surrounding the Bulls, and I have no statistics to sort of go off of here, I just feel like they always do the most surprising thing in the biggest moments, whether it be sort of collapsing against a bad team or beating up on a team that they're supposed to lose to. They are just a very strange team to really get a grasp on, but I do like a lot of their players, and I think that the sub 500 record probably isn't fully indicative of what they're capable of. Now, we'll get more so into the Bulls in the next segment when we talk about their game last night, but I don't feel very good about Miami going forward. Again, whether it's this game on Friday alone, or if they were to make the actual playoffs and face off against the Celtics, I think they might be in for a lot of trouble, which just sort of, I think that they're in a very interesting situation here where as long as they have Jimmy Butler, they feel like they can compete in the playoffs, but there has been a consistent level of injury concern with him. He hasn't played more than 65 games in a regular season since the 2016-17 season. And, they have these pieces that are, very solid for them in Tyler Hero as a building block. Jaime Jaquez Jr. is going to be on an all-rookie team as well. But outside of that, there's just sort of a lot of mediocrity, I think, on this Heat team. And we see that in terms of at least, having an offensive identity. I don't really feel like they have one. Now, we'll see sort of how this all plays out for them. But a little bit as well as a result of this injury, I do want to briefly touch on here the situation now surrounding the Boston Celtics, who, like I mentioned, came off of the most wins in the league in the regular season this year, locked down the 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, and are now going to be playing the winner of the Heat versus Bulls game on Friday. They are now going to either be facing off of a Jimmy Butler-less Heat team in the first round, or a Bulls team that, like I said, I do like a lot of the pieces they have. Kobe White was phenomenal last night. He was my pick for most improved player this year. Plus some of the other guard play that they get. I know that DeMar is more of a forward at this point in his career, but DeMar is still as solid as it comes. And Ayo Dosunmu has become a very interesting piece for Chicago. Seems like he's going to be a steal for Chicago. I believe they took him in the second round a couple years ago, but for the Celtics here, they're going to either get a sub 500 team or a Heat team that wasn't very good in the regular season and is now without their best player. So that's the first round matchup. In the second round, they're going to be facing either the Cavs or the Magic, who are both fully capable of providing a tough series, but are both very flawed in their different ways, shouldn't be on the same class level of the Celtics, and I'm not going to say cakewalk because I feel like that's extremely disrespectful to these teams that are going to be in the playoff picture, but the Celtics should, in some sense, easily find themselves in the Eastern Conference Finals, and this is the team that has the most pressure from the media in terms of winning a championship this year, and they have just about a golden path in front of them to make that happen. Now, when it comes to the finals specifically, if they have to go up against the Denver Nuggets, I feel like that is a matchup they probably lose, but sort of feels like they have to at least make the finals. And again, I'm not going to say, I feel like the term failure can be thrown around a lot and can be maybe a little loose, but it does feel like there is a real failure potential here with the Celtics. Let me know what you think about what would classify as a failure for the Celtics. I don't think it would be losing to the Nuggets in the finals, but you know, to some degree, anything short of that does feel like it would be a major disappointment for them. And this is just a golden opportunity. They are going to be, I mean, they already are as it is, but now with the Drew Holiday contract extension, Brad Stevens spoke the other day. Sounds like he intends to sign Derek White to a contract extension, along with the fact that Jason Tatum is due for his Supermax this offseason. This is going to be an extremely expensive team. And while talented, and I do think that there are ways they can build around this group along the edges after being in that second threshold and being a little bit more limited on the types of transactions they can make, this does feel like the year that it would be easiest for them to capitalize on the weaker Eastern Conference, the amount of talent that they currently have, and I think there are going to be real questions surrounding this team to some degree in terms of specifically that pairing of Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, because if they can't get it done this year, again, Nuggets are sort of tough because they have the best player in the NBA in Nikola Jokic, but you know, outside of that, what else would it take outside of this year for Tatum and Brown to come home with the championship? I've been on the boat even when they were at that 500 mark for a lot of the 2020-21 season through the first half of the year and even into the playoffs. They ended up playing in the play-in tournament that year, but even at that point, I was on the boat of let these two develop alongside one another. They're still very young. They have plenty of time to capitalize, but you know, now being 26, 27, this is the time where they should be really entering their primes. And again, the way that the Eastern Conference is currently sort of slated, it seems like it is absolutely theirs for the taking. But I guess we'll have to see how this plays out. Again, play-in game on Friday night to determine who they are going to be facing in the first round. Let me know what your predictions for that game are. But on that note, we are going to be taking our second break of the show, and when we dive back in here, we're going to be talking about the Chicago Bulls and their dominant win over the Atlanta Hawks. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are now going to be diving into the play-in game between the Chicago Bulls and Atlanta Hawks. We talked about the Sixers Heat game earlier. This one definitely had a different feel offensively, as it was much higher scoring. The Bulls win 131-116, and that's in part due to the fact that the Hawks defense has really been struggling, especially as of late. But I want to focus a little bit more on the positives, of course, here. That's the type of enjoy basketball mindset that we have here at the GSMC Sports Podcast. But it was Coby White scoring a career-high 42 points in this game. That was just so fun to watch. He was a candidate for Most Improved Player, probably going to be the runner-up in the award, but I think should be the winner. And what he was able to do in this game, it's just so fun to watch him. Again, Atlanta doesn't necessarily have this dominant post defense, and that is very much underselling the struggles they have in the paint for the Hawks here. But Coby White, with some of the ball handling, the patience, and the angles that he takes to get to the rim, it's so fun. He just slithers his way in with the lateral steps and finds his way, and has great touch at the rim as well. So he scores a career high. Now, technically, this doesn't count, which is sort of what I was talking about in the first segment as well. The NBA has to find some sort of way to classify these games so they don't just go into a blank void in terms of NBA statistics. Even if it is its own category, it's got to be something, because right now it's not regular season, it's not playoffs, and it's almost unofficial, similar to how the in-season tournament was earlier this season. But again, it was Coby White really leading the way here. DeMar DeRozan also was masterful. His numbers don't maybe pop off quite as much based off of how things played out here, but he was the one who, he's just such this steadying presence for Chicago, and he's always been a pro's pro, but he got the game started off right with 11 points. He was 5 of 7 from the field, had 5 assists, and from that point, again, took a little bit of a backseat, which is what he's done at times. You see, I mean, seriously, if you watch some of the stuff that he does off ball, it's almost this on-the-court coaching mindset where he directs a lot of traffic, specifically offensively, for the growth of Coby White this season. I feel like there are times where you sort of see Coby White with the ball, with a defender that he can get by on him, and he will, this has happened on a couple instances, he'll look over to DeMar, and DeMar will point at him saying go, and he does, and ends up capitalizing on it. I think that he is such an incredible presence for a team. I feel like you can say that with a handful of these Bulls players, and then you look at their record, you say, how are they 500? How has this organization not made a player transaction in terms of a trade since 2021? They're just letting all of these solid players sort of waste away in this mediocrity. But at the same time, they have a chance to actually officially make the playoffs this year when they face off against the Miami Heat on Friday in a rematch of last year's play-in tournament, where the Bulls actually had the lead in that one late in the fourth quarter and let it fall from their grasp. But I thought something that sort of added in to how impressive this win was over Atlanta was the fact that Alex Caruso was dealing with an injury throughout. He ended up getting run over, just straight steamrolled by Andre Drummond very early in that second quarter. Drummond stepped on his foot and just sort of ran through him. Quite the embodiment of the Bulls can't seem to get out of their own way, but Caruso ended up limping to the bench, had a heat pack on his foot for the majority of the game. I think he briefly checked in the third quarter, but he didn't play very much in this game, only 17 minutes. He obviously, their all-defense caliber guard, that is going to be a big loss for them, assuming that this is a serious injury and they have a chance to advance to the playoffs if they can win on Friday. We don't necessarily have updates on that specifically at the moment. Sort of alluded to him earlier in the show, but I mean, some of these second round picks that they've just hit on in recent years, it's Ayo Dosunmu, and then Dalen Terry was actually a late first round pick. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head here, but both of them have just emerged as real contributors for Chicago this season. And the level of, guard forward play, they just seem to have depth. And again, sometimes I look at this Bulls team and I just question why they aren't better than they are. And in large part, it is due to the fact that their defense is pretty mediocre. They finished the regular season 21st in defensive rating. I think a big issue with that is the fact that as much as Nikola Vucevic does show some, real promise, obviously, as an offensive scorer. I believe he's a 2-time All-Star, at least a 1-time All-Star, but he doesn't really have a great paint presence as much as I like Kobe White as well. Some of the attentiveness with him, he can get sort of caught in off-ball situations. I'm sure it seems like that guy has one of the highest motors in the league in terms of not just on the court play, but some of the stories that you hear about him, it seems like he's extremely driven to be better. He wants to live up to the draft pick that he was selected with. I believe it was the 7th overall pick. I gotta have more of these draft numbers ready on hand. I didn't realize I was going to be talking about draft selections quite as much as I was today, but he was selected 7th overall in that 2019 class that does have a handful of players who have sort of emerged as, prominent role players, some even better than that in Zion and Ja, of course, but having a bunch of these guys sort of finding their success, he seems like he really wants to continue to improve. Obviously, most improved player candidate this season, and should be a lot of fun to see, I think, monitoring his growth in the coming years, because he's still only 24 years old, just turned 24, so I see a lot of promise with him. An example of why not to give up on players so early in their career. But we will, I guess, now be moving on to the idea of the Atlanta Hawks in this situation, where I know that the final score is 15, and the Hawks were actually in the game in the third quarter, went on a little bit of a run to make this a little bit more contested, but they were so unable to get stops. Now, Trae Young is going to be a big story out of this one. His stat line ends up looking okay, 22 points and 10 assists, but he was coming back. This was only his 4th game back from injury, I believe, after breaking his thumb, or it was one of his fingers. It looked like he had his ring finger and pinky finger tied together, or taped together, I should say, in that second half. But Trae was really struggling early in this game, had 5 turnovers in the first half, and in a handful of these instances, it seemed like it wasn't even the decision-making with it, but he just didn't have almost the right feel on the ball itself. Now, I'd have to go back and look at specifically what hand these turnovers were sort of caused by, but there was a level of frustration from DeJounte Murray headed into halftime, where Trae threw this, I wouldn't call it reckless necessarily. It was a behind-the-back pass to DeJounte Murray on the perimeter that if it had hit him, right in the chest, it would have been fine. DeJounte could have gotten a shot up, but it was off, forced DeJounte into a little bit of a compromising situation. The Hawks didn't get off a shot in that instance, and Murray was definitely frustrated with Trae, which does sort of signify this idea of what are the Hawks going to do in the offseason. They decided not to trade DeJounte Murray during the trade deadline. Trae Young then goes down with an injury, and the reason why the Hawks didn't trade DeJounte is seemingly because of the fact that DeJounte was sort of not performing to the level of his expectations. I mean, that's sort of understating it almost, from when they traded multiple first-round picks for him a couple years ago, and it didn't seem like they were seeing eye to eye with some suitors in terms of what his value would be, and so they decided to stick with him. Trae Young then soon gets injured afterwards, and we see this version of DeJounte really sort of asserting himself once again, and he was really good in this game, specifically in the first half. He really got himself cooking in the second quarter, notably in the minutes where Trae Young was on the bench. In the first 4 minutes of the second quarter, DeJounte Murray had 10 points, and the Hawks ended up outscoring the Bulls by 13 in that stretch there. Now, again, very small sample size, would be reckless to sort of say that is make a bigger deal out of that than things currently stand, but I do think the Hawks are going to have to make a change. It doesn't seem like that DeJounte and Trae Young backcourt is something that is sustainable in terms of winning a finals. Now, the move itself, when they made it, was definitely a little overly ambitious. They had just made the Eastern Conference Finals in a little bit of a weird year. I forget who they played in the first round, but then they got a 76ers team with an injured Joel Embiid. That was, of course, the Ben Simmons series where his brain broke and he just hasn't been the same since. But, I think that to some degree the Hawks are going to have to try and salvage what they have left here, and they're going to have to make a decision between DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. And I have never been a massive Trae Young fan. I also understand that you can't just look at how he performed in both this game and sort of the last few games of the regular season and say this is why DeJounte is better, because Trae Young had just missed over a month with an injury and was clearly still dealing with it at this point. But I do think that you can sort of undisputably get more in a trade package for Trae Young than you can for DeJounte Murray, and that's something that maybe kick the tires on. Again, see what type of teams are out there available. There have been rumors about the Spurs potentially wanting to go and get Trae Young. Something that I noticed, and again, not to blow things out of proportion by any means, but it did just seem like, obviously, and the reputation around Trae a little bit, is he racks up these assists, but their majority just through a pick and roll game. He doesn't really run a team style offense. All 6 of his assists in the first half were to Clint Capella in a 2-man game. Couple lobs and a couple nice passes, but also sort of some of them a little bit more underwhelming. I definitely wouldn't say that he was this great team player dishing out 6 assists in the first half. Now, he had a couple more drive-in kicks to the corner where there were even some instances where his teammates didn't come through for him. And I don't know, this Hawks team is just very interesting now. They also were missing 2 of their young forwards in Sadiq Bey and Jalen Johnson because they were injured earlier this season. So there's a lot of pieces here. I'm not sure how they're going to play this out. Part of the reason I also sort of entertain the possibility, I'm not saying 100% do it, but the possibility of trading Trae Young is because of the fact it would have been very strange, I think, for them to, even if they didn't see eye to eye with other teams surrounding DeJounte Murray's contract situation, you still or his value, I should say, you still knew that Trae and DeJounte really weren't a match in the backcourt. I don't think I'm breaking any news really by making that type of a statement. And if you knew that you weren't going to pay him this offseason, I do think it would be a little weird for them to hold on to him just for the sake of it. But definitely curious what you all think about that situation, because I feel like the Hawks have one of the more difficult off seasons to manage, as they are currently sitting around this little bit of mediocrity. But I'm also a huge fan of what Jalen Johnson put out there this season. I think if he had qualified with the 65 games played, he would have been a prime candidate for most improved player as well. Saddiq Bey is somebody who has seen some ups and downs since he has entered the league, but has showed just a ton of reliability for the most part. I know that he had a little bit of a slump shooting-wise in his second season, but is somebody that, especially in a Trae Young system, I think could probably flourish some. But again, let me know what you think the Hawks should do in the offseason. I'm sure we will dive into that much more when the time calls for it. But we're going to be now taking our final break. And when we come back on the other side, we will be diving into the ESPN story that was released, I believe it was yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, surrounding Bill Belichick and his offseason prospects, and how Robert Kraft could have sort of meddled into that situation. So stick with us and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day. We've talked a lot of basketball today, but I do want to touch on the story that was released from ESPN within the past couple days about the Bill Belichick offseason job hunt. The story itself is called Inside Bill Belichick's Failed Offseason Job Hunt. And the story went through the process that Belichick went through this offseason, looking for a head coaching job for the first time since 1998. And it talked about the different situations surrounding the head coaching vacancies across the league and how one by one these organizations shut him out. He was really never in heavy consideration for many of these jobs as a whole, but there was some thought that he could end up with the Atlanta Falcons. He ended up interviewing with them twice before they ultimately went a different direction in Raheem Morris. So in those two interviews with Arthur Blank, the first one was just a one-on-one Bill Belichick and Blank on Blank's super yacht. According to the story, Blank came out of that meeting and told his colleagues that he was very impressed by Belichick. In that meeting, Bill said that he didn't want to take over the full control of the decision-making process and have that type of power that he did in New England. He wasn't asking for a change in the decision makers. He reportedly, quote, insisted he just wants to coach. And coming out of this, a source close to Belichick said that from his vantage point, quote, Blank came away from the boat thinking, this is my guy. And Belichick was confident that he was going to be the next head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. There was then a second meeting where Belichick met with Blank and the remainder of the current infrastructure of decision makers. And at some point in between that first and second meeting, Arthur Blank spoke to Patriots owner Robert Kraft multiple times. And a confidant of Belichick gave a quote to ESPN for this story, saying that, quote, Robert called Arthur to warn him not to trust Bill. This quote was then backed up by a second source, one of a close friend of Robert Kraft. And there was another quote thrown in there as well, that Kraft told Blank, you'll never have a warm conversation with Belichick. And these conversations reportedly shifted the mindset of the decision-making process with Arthur Blank, and it led to that second interview being more along the lines of giving Belichick the respect he deserved of not just being shut out after one interview, more than it actually was an interview to lock down Belichick as their next head coach. Now, Robert Kraft denies saying anything negative about Belichick in the conversations with Blank during the coaching search. Specifically, there was a quote saying he had no recollection of doing that. Pretty unconvincing there, if you ask me. But there is reportedly a possibility that Kraft could have made some comments to Blank during the regular season about his displeasure with Belichick during the disastrous year for the Patriots. But one way or another, the ESPN story portrays that these conversations between Blank and Kraft, quote, was a big part of why the Falcons went another direction with their head coach search. And, you know, that's just a quote from an anonymous source, but the idea of Kraft actually picking up the phone proactively and calling Arthur Blank just to tell him that to not trust Belichick would be a bad look for Kraft in my eyes. And for as much slack as Belichick gets during this post-Tom Brady era in New England, I do think that Kraft deserves some of the blame as well, and some of it goes beyond even just the post-Brady era, where clearly Belichick was in the wrong for trying to push Tom Brady out. Robert Kraft has sort of made it clear that it was Belichick, that Kraft was Team Brady. Belichick sort of made the decision, and it's his fault that Brady went elsewhere and won a Super Bowl. But there is also something to the fact that Brady, for a very long time with New England, was willing to take pay cuts in order to help improve the roster around him. And it got to a certain point during his final couple years there in New England where he looked around and the Patriots had just failed to get him adequate weapons. In 2019, his last season with the Patriots, they had Julian Edelman still, who, of course, is one of Brady's top targets of his career. But Edelman at that point wasn't 100% healthy necessarily. He was able to rack up, though, 100 receptions and 1,100 yards. But after him, the two highest receivers in terms of yards were running back James White and wide receiver Philip Dorsett, who didn't even crack 400 yards. And part of that is, to be fair, due to the fact that Belichick was really struggling drafting skill position players, especially in his final seasons. It was never his expertise, but in that 2019 season as well, they spent their first round pick on N'Keal Harry, where there were plenty of other talented receivers available that have gone on to be big-time players, including T. Higgins, A.J. Brown, and others as well. But another part of the reason that the receivers around Brady weren't good enough is the fact that there was some conflict between Belichick and Kraft surrounding the willingness to actually go and spend money. And Kraft makes it seem like Belichick had all the control he wanted in terms of making these types of decisions and off-season moves, but according to ESPN's roster management system, the Patriots ranked last in the league in cash spending over the past decade. And again, the fact that it is rumored that there was this contention between Kraft and Belichick surrounding the payroll, does sort of reflect back on Robert Kraft and this past offseason, despite Gerard Mayo saying, yeah, we're going to go out and acquire talent. We have all this cap space. And he said, quote, we have money to burn. They didn't really end up making any moves in free agency, which I have expressed this before. Sometimes making the panic moves in free agency are actually the ones that end up doing you wrong as the years progress. But it's just a consistent theme with these Kraft teams that they aren't going out and spending consistently in free agency. And as a result, the roster isn't quite as good as it should be. And again, Belichick was in charge of a lot of the personnel decisions as well. The drafting had been horrific. I also feel like there was a level of pettiness, especially in last year's draft, where I think that there was almost a little bit of a vendetta against Mac Jones for complaining against the way that Belichick positioned him so much last year. Mac Jones was very unhappy with the Matt Patricia at offensive coordinator experiment. I myself was as well, but now then he went out in the draft and really refused to go and get any types of weapons. Pop Douglas actually ended up being a solid player for them, but he was a 6th round pick out of Liberty, so they didn't draft any skill position players. I think up until then they drafted a couple offensive linemen in like the 4th and 5th rounds, but no offensive players in the top 2, despite their defense actually being good in the 2023 season and or the 2022 season, and the offense being a disaster. So again, there's all of these different factors in here. Last stuff on Kraft here is they also released the Dynasty docuseries that sort of came from a Kraft production camp, and I've only watched the first 2 episodes, so I can't definitively have an opinion on it. But the reputation surrounding it is that it was sort of to boost Kraft's reputation while simultaneously tearing down Bill Belichick. From the first episode, you would have thought that benching Drew Bledsoe for Tom Brady was a mistake. And they spent basically a whole hour-long episode talking about how risky it was for the Patriots to hire Bill Belichick because of the situation that was surrounding him when he was with the Cleveland Browns as the head coach there. They practically skipped over 2 whole Super Bowls. And again, I haven't seen the full docuseries. If you have, definitely let me know what your thoughts were. But former Patriots players and viewers all seem to sort of share this sentiment that it was Kraft sort of trying to give himself more credit for this whole thing about how Bill Belichick, it was a mess behind closed doors and Kraft was able to keep it all together. And it's just a lot of Robert Kraft sort of pointing fingers to why they haven't been successful. And I also think that moving on from Bill Belichick was the right decision this offseason. With his history at general manager, it had not been good and they needed a change, but now there's nobody else to blame here, and I do think that Robert Kraft is under a lot of pressure in this situation. Briefly here, as for Belichick and his future, Robert Kraft talking to Arthur Blank was not the sole reason that Belichick doesn't have a head coaching job today. If you look at the interview process with Atlanta alone, the Falcons were looking at 14 different candidates. They did a voting process democratically where they ranked the top candidates, and Belichick didn't finish in anyone's top 3, according to the ESPN article. And the fact that the Falcons were the only team that had any interest in him does speak volumes, I think. Now, there are a couple different reasons for this. Mike Lombardi in this article was quoted saying that outside of the owners themselves, a lot of these other key decision makers in these franchises were uncomfortable with bringing in Belichick because they were trying to protect their own job. Belichick obviously has a history with having a very high level of power and influence on an ownership group. His stature and resume could be intimidating for someone willingly wanting to hire him as a subordinate, knowing the level of power that could grow with him, and didn't want to affect their standing with the franchise. But a member of one of the teams that had a head coaching vacancy this offseason spoke to ESPN in this article and raised concerns about Belichick's ability to build a culture at this point in his career. I think I disagree with that point as far as winning and unselfish play, and I know that the Patriots way is a little bit overblown, but I do think that Belichick can still provide a championship culture. But another fair point that was made as well was the fact that for an owner in a lot of these situations, and especially you look at the vacancies with a lot of these teams, they're not necessarily in the situation where they're maybe a head coach away from winning a Super Bowl and handing the keys to somebody who it would be a brand new face within your franchise, and knowing there's only there's a chance he could only coach 2 or 3 years. I understand the hesitation there. Future is very uncertain for Bill Belichick, who is one of, if not the greatest head coaches in NFL history. So as things currently stand, it seems like next year might also be difficult for him to get a job. He's going to be a year older. Now, again, like I talked about, sort of the classification of a lot of these franchises that could have a vacancy is a big deal in this. Need to sort of be more in the win now mode. Some teams that could potentially see changes in head coaches: the Bills, the Cowboys, the Steelers, the Eagles. There was a little bit of rumblings this past offseason. Tomlin's headed into his last season under his contract. Again, I think they're all sort of long shots. And speaking of long shot, there was also the rumor that was sort of thrown around there headed into the Super Bowl that if Andy Reid was going to retire, then Belichick could possibly find his way in there. Now, that's one definitely an absolute long shot. Even if Reid were to retire, I'm sure the Chiefs to some degree are looking a little bit more long term, despite also being in win now mode, considering their window is open as long as they have Patrick Mahomes. But it is a very interesting conversation, and I don't really know what is next for Bill Belichick, but that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Follow us on socials for more exclusive content as well. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock Eastern. We will see you then.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that